October winds in the Montana high country do not merely blow, they hunt. They strip the gold from the aspens and whisper promises of a brutal, unforgiving winter. Hannah Higgins stood on the gravel shoulder of County Road 9, her breath pluming in the crisp air, staring at the heavy iron gate that had just been padlocked shut. On the other side of that gate sat the ranch house she had spent 5 years restoring, and inside it was Owen Carmichael, the man who had just legally and ruthlessly stolen her life. Owen, her former business partner, had exploited a buried clause in their joint tenancy agreement. When Hannah's mother fell ill and Hannah missed a single obscure property tax deadline to pay for medical bills, Owen executed a hostile buyout clause. He had lawyers from Bozeman draft the paperwork. A judge, blind to the human element and strictly adhering to the letter of the contract, granted the eviction. Hannah was given 48 hours to vacate. With her bank account strained from legal fees and medical debts, Hannah had nowhere to go. The local shelters in town were full, and pride kept her from begging friends who were already struggling with the failing local mill. All she possessed was a beaten-up 1998 Ford Ranger, a few boxes of winter clothes, her grandfather's antique logging tools, and a deed to 8 acres of seemingly worthless, rocky hillside known as Blackwood Ridge. Blackwood Ridge was completely off the grid, accessible only by a rutted logging road. It possessed no cabin, no power lines, and no septic system. What it did have was a steep earthen bank and a fast-moving dark ribbon of water called Miller's Creek that cut through the valley floor. Driving up the mountain that afternoon, Hannah knew she was racing against the sky. The Farmer's Almanac had predicted the worst blizzard in a decade, slated to hit by mid-November. She had less than 3 weeks to build a shelter, or she would freeze to death. Arriving at the property, the reality of her situation settled in like a stone in her stomach. The temperature was already dropping into the 20s at night. She pitched a canvas hunting tent she had bought at a pawn shop managed by an old acquaintance, Arthur Pendleton. But a tent would not survive a Montana January, where temperatures routinely plunged to 30 below zero. Hannah knew she couldn't build a log cabin in 3 weeks by herself. She needed the earth. She needed a dugout. Using her grandfather's heavy iron pickaxe and a broad shovel, Hannah began to excavate the side of a steep, south-facing hill. It was back-breaking, agonizing labor. Her hands blossomed with blisters that burst and bled into her work gloves. She dug from dawn until the last sliver of purple light faded behind the jagged peaks. She carved out a room 12 feet wide and 10 feet deep, reinforcing the earthen walls with fallen lodgepole pines she dragged from the forest. For a roof, she scavenged corrugated tin from a collapsed miner's shack miles down the road, layering it with heavy pine boughs, tarps, and 2 feet of packed soil for insulation. But as the dugout took shape, a terrifying realization dawned on her. Once the heavy snows came, leaving the dugout to fetch water from Miller's Creek would become a deadly chore. A whiteout blizzard could disorient a person 10 feet from their door. Furthermore, if the creek froze solid at the edges, she would have to chop through ice every day just to survive. She needed water inside the dugout. Looking at the slope of the land, Hannah hatched the desperate, seemingly impossible plan. The creek sat about 40 yards away and slightly uphill from the floor level of her dugout. If she could dig a deep enough trench from the creek to her shelter, she could divert a small, steady trickle of water directly through her living space before routing it back outside to flow down the mountain. She had just 4 days before the first major front was scheduled to hit. Hannah attacked the frozen ground with a manic intensity fueled by pure survival instinct. The top layer of soil had already begun to freeze, requiring her to strike it violently with the pickaxe just to break through. Inch by inch, foot by foot, she dug a narrow trench, plunging it 3 feet deep to get below the impending frost line. She lined the bottom of the trench with smooth river stones to prevent the water from turning her floor into a mud pit. Halfway to the creek, the pickaxe struck something that sent a jarring shock up her arms. It wasn't a rock. It was a dense layer of clay, and beneath it, the earth was strangely soft. As she dug deeper, water began to seep into the trench, bubbling up from the ground itself. Hannah dropped to her knees, dipping her bare, calloused hand into the mud. She gasped. The water wasn't freezing. It was distinctly warm. She had tapped into a deep subterranean thermal seep, a common, yet hidden feature in this volcanically active region of the Rockies. It wasn't boiling like a hot spring, but it hovered consistently around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. In the bitter cold of the impending winter, 55 degrees was a miracle. A profound shift in her engineering strategy occurred in that muddy ditch. Instead of just bringing drinking water inside, Hannah realized she could use the earth's blood to fight the winter. Working through the night, by the light of a kerosene lantern, Hannah widened the trench leading into her dugout. Inside her crude earthen home, she dug a sprawling, serpentine channel across the entire floor. Like the coils of a radiator, she lined the entire network with the thermal mud and river rocks. Finally, she broke the bank of Miller's Creek, allowing the fast-moving, deep aquifer water to mix with the thermal seep and rush into her trench system. The water flowed steadily into her dugout, weaving beneath the flat slate stones she had painstakingly hauled to serve as her floor, before draining out the downhill side of the shelter and rejoining the creek. 2 days later, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind howled through the pines, and the snow began to fall. It didn't stop for 4 days. 50 miles away, in the comfort of Hannah's former ranch house, Owen Carmichael sat by a roaring fireplace, sipping bourbon. He had assumed Hannah had done the sensible thing and driven back to Ohio to live with extended family. He had already listed the Blackwood Ridge property for sale, having forged a document claiming she abandoned it. To him, Hannah was a ghost, a loose end neatly tied up. But upon Blackwood Ridge, under 3 feet of snow, Hannah Higgins was very much alive. The dugout was small, smelling of pine pitch and damp earth, but it was a fortress. The wind screamed above her, driving the ambient temperature outside to 25 below zero. Yet inside, a miracle of primitive thermodynamics was occurring. The water flowing continuously beneath the slate floor remained a steady 50 degrees. Because it was always moving, it never froze. More importantly, it acted as a massive thermal battery. The heat radiated upward through the slate. Combined with the heavy insulation of the earthen walls, the deep snow on the roof acting as an igloo shell, and the radiant heat from her small cast-iron wood stove, the temperature inside the dugout hovered at a comfortable, life-saving 60 degrees. Her floor never froze. While the world outside was a deadly, crystalline wasteland, Hannah walked across her stone floor in nothing but thick wool socks, feeling the gentle, persistent warmth of the earth beneath her feet. She spent the winter reading by lantern light, rationing her dried goods, and listening to the soft, rhythmic gurgling of the creek water flowing beneath her bed. By late February, the worst of the deep freeze broke. The roads became passable, though heavily rutted. Rumors had begun to circulate in town. Arthur Pendleton had mentioned to Sheriff Tom Buckley that Hannah had bought a winter tent and headed up to the ridge back in October. When Owen Carmichael came into town to finalize the illegal sale of the ridge to a commercial logging outfit, the sheriff confronted him. "You telling me you let her go up to Blackwood in October and you haven't checked on her?" Sheriff Buckley demanded, his hand resting on his duty belt. "Nobody has seen her in 4 months, Owen. If she's dead up there, I'm holding you responsible." Panicked that a manslaughter investigation would ruin his lucrative real estate deals, Owen agreed to guide the sheriff and a search and rescue deputy up the logging road and to track Snowcat. Owen felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He expected to find a collapsed tent and a frozen corpse. He had already begun rehearsing his alibi, reminding himself that he wasn't legally responsible for her poor choices. The Snowcat chewed through the deep drifts, finally arriving at the GPS coordinates of the property. There was no cabin, no tent, just an unbroken expanse of blinding white snow against the hillside. "She's gone," Owen said, trying to mask his immense relief. "She must have left before the snows." Sheriff Buckley stepped out of the vehicle. his boots crunching in the crust. He squinted at the hillside. Hold on! Look there. A thin, almost invisible wisp of gray smoke was curling up from a metal pipe protruding directly out of the snowbank, and below it the snow had melted away in a strange, straight line down the hill, revealing a narrow, steaming trench of running water. Buckley drew his sidearm, not knowing what to expect, and approached the hillside. He found a heavy wooden door, built into the earth, reinforced with iron hinges. He knocked heavily. A moment later, the door creaked open. Hannah Higgins stood there. She was leaner, her face tanned from the glare of the winter sun off the snow, and her eyes held a fierce, feral light. She looked strong. She looked invincible. "Sheriff," Hannah said calmly, pulling a heavy wool shawl around her shoulders. She barely glanced at Owen, who was staring at her as if she were a ghost rising from the grave. "Hannah, we thought you were dead," Sheriff Buckley stammered, lowering his weapon. He looked past her shoulder, into the dugout. He expected a miserable, freezing ice cave. Instead, a wave of humid, warm air washed over his face. He looked down at the slate floor, entirely dry and radiating heat, with the sound of running water echoing beneath it. "I dug in," Hannah said simply. Owen pushed past the sheriff, his eyes darting around the property, doing the math in his head. He noticed the steam rising from the drainage trench. "Geothermal," he breathed. "There's a hot spring on this tract." His greed instantly overrode his shock. A geothermal water source dramatically increased the value of the land. It could be used for a commercial resort, a greenhouse operation, or mineral extraction. "You need to vacate the premises immediately," Owen snapped, regaining his usual arrogant posture. "This land is in the process of being sold. You abandoned it. I filed the paperwork in December." Hannah's eyes narrowed. The twist Owen hadn't accounted for was the very nature of survival. It strips away fear and leaves only hard, absolute resolve. "I didn't abandon anything," Hannah said, her voice like cracking ice. And he didn't file legal paperwork, Owen. You filed fraudulent claims." She stepped back into the dugout and retrieved a metal lockbox. From it, she pulled a pristine, watermarked document. "When my grandfather left me this land, he didn't just leave me the surface rights," Hannah said, holding up the paper for the sheriff to see. "He secured the senior water rights to Miller's Creek and the subterranean mineral rights. It's an ironclad legacy patent from 1912. And as for the property tax you used to steal the ranch, I had Arthur Pendleton mail the cashier's check to the county clerk the day before you locked me out. It was postmarked in time. You foreclosed on a phantom debt." Owen's face went pale. "That's a lie." The judge only saw what you showed him," Sheriff Buckley interrupted, taking the document from Hannah and examining the county seal. He looked at Owen with utter disgust. "Looks to me like you've been filing false instruments with the county, Owen. That's a felony." The wind howled across the ridge, but inside the dugout, the air remained still and warm. Owen stood completely defeated, realizing that the woman he had thrown away to die had not only survived the deadliest winter in a decade, but had unearthed the very resources that would secure her future and ruin his. Sheriff Buckley tipped his hat to Hannah. "I'll be taking Mr. Carmichael back to town now for a long conversation with the district attorney. You need anything from the store, Anna?" Hannah looked down at the slate floor, feeling the steady, thrumming pulse of the warm water beneath her boots. It was the heartbeat of the mountain, a lifeline she had carved out with her own 2 hands. "No, Sheriff," Hannah smiled, leaning against the heavy timber frame of her door. "I've got everything I need right here."